3, 2, 1. Mr. Schneider, let's do this.
Yeah, I'm excited.
And here we go. It's Let's Solve the Universe. We are live here with Mr. Mark Schneider, president at Gen 4 Nuclear Incorporated. Mr. Schneider, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I am super excited to talk about all things nuclear today. Specifically, I've seen a lot of your posts about Generation 4 nuclear power, and I'm sure audience has got a lot of questions about nuclear power in general, just because, well, obviously it seems like a very clean energy source, seems like a very efficient energy source, but nuclear kind of scares us as a population. So, let's start out by saying, when we talk about nuclear power, what's actually happening in a nuclear reactor? Like, how does nuclear power even work? Let's start there.
So, the basic principle is, if you go back to your physics and you talk with you discuss with Einstein, of E equals mc squared. That's what we're using. I'm taking that breaking that equation. The E is energy. That's what we want, and it's equal to mass times the speed of light squared, right? And so what we've done in nuclear energy is that we're basically destroying very minute amounts of matter, but you get mass quantities of energy. So there's no carbon dioxide production in this. And in the way we do this in the United States, is that we take a heavy atom like a uranium atom, a neutron hits it, and it splits into two smaller atoms. And in the process, a very tiny amount of mass is lost, and it creates a lot of heat and light and energy. And then we use that to basically boil water, and that water becomes steam, and it turns a turbine. So if you look at electrical generation, with the exception of solar, everything falls in line with the exact same principle of, I need to turn a turbine around to generate electricity. So really the principle between nuclear compared to gas, compared to wind, compared to coal, is how do I get that turbine to spin? What's my source? You can think of your car. It turns to create drive your shaft. Well, you could hook up a gasoline engine to a generator to generate power. You see that all the time when you drive around. You see the temporary light poles that are up. Well, on a nuclear power plant, we're just doing this at a large scale that can power, 1 million homes. So that's the only difference, is that we can scale this up. But it comes down to that. We just take this special magical fuel, it's uranium. It hits a little neutron hits it, and it splits, and then you have to control that reaction.
Interesting. So sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, yeah, you go ahead.
So I'm thinking, as you're talking about we're spinning a turbine of some sort, it brings me back to thinking about kind of like a water mill. I'm thinking back to sort of old water mills where you use the power of the river's current to power this mill, and that's how you break down grains. So it's kind of like that, except on a really big scale.
That's a perfect example of how it is, because that's how you described how a hydroelectric dam works to make power. Is that they use water running through it. They basically have two different differential heights, and that water runs down. It goes through a blading system, a paddle system, and then it spins in a circle, and then that drives a turbine that makes your electricity.
Interesting. Now, you also say destroying matter. So this sounds like you're almost taking these, I think they're fuel rods, right?
Yeah.
So you take these fuel rods, they get inserted into a reactor, and when you say we're destroying matter, is it similar to the process of, say, you've got a wood stove, you put wood in there, you burn that down, and that's how you generate your fire, and that's how you produce heat, and maybe use that heat to power something else? Or is it sort of the same principle when you're using these fuel rods?
It's actually different, and this is where nuclear separates from all the other power sources. If you took your wood stove and you put the wood in there and you burn it, and then it collected all the exhaust that comes off of that, and you weighed the ashes, everything, and you weighed it all, it would have the same amount of weight when you're done. So you have you have the matter from the beginning and the end is the same. You've just changed what the matter is, right? Whether, in wood, you're turning that wood, you're turning it into, ash, and it becomes carbon dioxide, it becomes water vapor. So your overall mass is the same when you're done. In nuclear, if you took the fuel rods in the reactor and you weighed them when you put them in, and then you weighed them when you pulled them out, because there's no oxygen involved, they actually weigh less. So there's less matter in the universe when we're done.
They weigh less. So take me through that. How does it? So if we're spending a nuclear rod, how does it weigh less? Is that how we get into? Does that have something to do with the nuclear reaction process?
Yes. So, and it's the same thing happens with fusion too. When you take two smaller atoms and combine them in the subatomic nuclear force, we're way into super technical detail, and I hope that I'm not going to go overly technical. But the process is that if you look at iron as like the most stable element in the universe, so as you're combining elements more and more, you actually lose tiny bits of matter in the process. It's through the nuclear forces between the nucleus of the atom, right, where that occurs. And then when you get above iron, when you split it down, you have a small amount of matter that's lost. We're talking extremely small quantities. You might have an 80,000, kilogram reactor, and the weight loss is going to be in the gram scale. We're not talking this is huge amount. It's not like you put it on there and you wake up in the morning, you weigh 200 pounds, and you go for a run, you do a bunch of things, and you may weigh 199 pounds. No, we're talking this is magnitudes of it'd be weighing 200 pounds, then now you weigh 199.9995 pounds. So we're very, very small amounts of matter are actually being destroyed to create this energy. And the matter we're destroying is stuff that we don't necessarily we don't necessarily need for any processes other than energy generation.
Interesting. So when we're talking about this nuclear fusion process, where we're talking about these fuel rods being spent, is that where we get into these different nuclear isotopes? Like we transform this what was one type of material has now become something else?
That you're hitting it right on the nose here, and there's two processes that occur. So I talked about the fission process, where that neutron strikes the atom, the uranium atom, or it could be other atoms, and we'll talk about those in just a second, because we'll talk about transmutation. And it splits, and this is the fission process, and it creates two smaller atoms, right? And so these atoms, there's a wide range, rubidium and cesium, but they're smaller on the scale. Or the other option is that neutron goes into the uranium atom, and the uranium atom absorbs it, and now it's at this higher energy state, and it doesn't like that, so it ejects radioactive particles. And what'll happen, say uranium-238 atom, it absorbs a neutron. That 238 is the total number of neutrons and protons. So now it's uranium-239. Uranium-239 doesn't like to be uranium-239, so it ejects actually an electron out of the reactor, which makes it more positive. Then it becomes neptunium. Neptunium-239 isn't very happy either, so then it ejects another electron and becomes plutonium. And plutonium is just another nuclear fuel that we can use.
Interesting. So that's how these different materials change weight, is because you're ejecting those atomic particles. You're either ejecting an electron or a neutron. Is that right?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that are ejected out of these fission, these different atoms. Like even natural uranium will eject a helium nucleus out. It's called an alpha particle. And so then if you take uranium-238, it then becomes thorium-234, because it's atomic mass unit or number of 4, because the helium nucleus is two neutrons and 2 protons, and thorium is atomic number 290. So, or atomic number 90, sorry. So it's very complex. And so whereas, I'm sure you grew up and you took, some kind of chemistry when you were, in middle school, high school, and you had the periodic table, right? The periodic table is the chemistry's, Bible, if you will, right? It's how we understand how different atoms interact with each other chemically. Well, in my field, we have what's called the chart on nuclides. So, your chemistry thing, you've got, your little, squares on it like this, and it'll fit on 11.5 by sheet of paper. The chart of nuclides, on the other hand, I have one in my house, and it takes up an entire wall because it's every single isotope for every single atom. So
that is that's a lot of nuclides. Wow. I
can actually show you if you want me to. I have it in my house. I can walk you over there if that'd be something you'd be interested in.
Absolutely. This will be the first.
Trip. I hope that it's not too. I keep it stable enough, so I'll give credit to my wife. She's the one who suggested that I take it over here. Oops, I'm losing my microphone. So.
I'll give you a sec there to readjust. This will be the first walking tour on Let's Solve the Universe. Awesome.
Yeah. So
I'll hold it for you.
This is so the nuclides are kind of the whoa. Okay, so for those who are listening to the audio version afterwards, we are seeing what almost looks like a map with a couple of rivers. I'll make sure to get a picture of this posted in the show notes.
Yeah,
that's
so
incredible.
If you go all the way up, I'll get this really close, and let's see if you can read some of those. But you can see I should be right about thorium, which is number 90.
Yes,
and it has about 20 isotopes to it. So there's 20 different kinds of thorium, right? So when we talk about nuclear and the complexities of it, that's the level of detail we're talking about. I mean, and that's why, it's very difficult to explain this in simple terms in a lot of ways, because you just saw how complex our basic is, right? This is, chemistry's basic is the periodic table, and that's our basic level for nuclear.
And then as somebody who's into nuclear power and is actually in the industry, is that I know the periodic table in high school was something we had to just slam into our heads. Is that whole table of nuclides, is that something that you would have to just have a 100% memorized knowledge of?
So you wouldn't memorize everything 100% on it, but what you can do with that is, I talked about that matter conversion. Right, I can take a uranium atom and I can find out the individual mass of a uranium-235 atom, the mass of a neutron, because that's included in it. And then if you give me a problem that says that, hey, in that, that neutron strikes the uranium atom, it produces element A and element B. I can look up those two elements and it produces, say, 3 neutrons. I add those up, and then I, add the uranium in the neutron, and then I add the resulting reaction, and I figured out the two masses, and then I could find out the matter difference, and that's how we calculate how much energy for that one fission.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm now wishing that I had stuck with my original route of going into chemistry.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. It's really neat, and those were actual problems that I had when I was going through my training in the Navy back in 1998. They would literally, and there's booklet forms of that book that we would have to go through and do those calculations on tests. So, understanding all that, and then, how does that, how much waste heat, it's a very complex discussion when you get into talking about operating a nuclear reactor. But overall, the principle, going back to that, it's very complex when we get into the nuts and bolts of it. But it comes down to that same thing. All I'm doing is I'm turning, the turbine to make the electricity. And, we have super smart guys, right? This guy, his name's James McLaughlin, and he has the best way of describing nuclear energy. And it's the magic rock boils the water, that makes the steam, that causes the roundy that causes the arky sparky, right? So super smart guy. And he comes up with this great way to describe it, so that, that's how I explain it to my kids and to a lot of people, but then you see how complex it can get. So
here's just I'm going to ask a totally stupid question here. How on earth did we manage as a species? I'm looking at the technologies and abilities we've got today. How on earth as a species did we figure out how to build a nuclear reactor back in the 1950s and 1960s. Like that seems mind-blowing to me that we even managed to pull it off in the first place.
So the nuclear power program's inception came from the Manhattan Project. So when the actual first, if you go even earlier than that, like the first nuclear, self-sustained nuclear reaction on the planet was at Chicago Pilot 1 in the university, right? And so we're talking about Madame Curie and Fermi, and if you actually go and you look at the plants around the United States, they all have these weird sounding names. They're basically named after all these famous nuclear physicists. And when you get above I think americium on the periodic table, all the atoms are named after them. So this is where you have the seaborgium, and it's just there's all these weird names that are named, all the famous physicists that figured out all this stuff. And you now have this glimpse of how complex it was, when they were doing the Manhattan Project. And now you see why, they were so important that they get an entire atom named after them.
Right. And I imagine probably those early days, very risky, because when was it that we really understood some of the risks involved with dealing with nuclear material?
I would say that we really started figuring it out in the 40s and 50s, and we started implementing policies in the 60s to really mitigate all that. And then it wasn't until the 80s the 80s and 90s that we truly put in very effective safety practices. If you look at going back to Madame Curie, right? Her and her husband, very important in the nuclear industry. She died of radiation sickness. So the work she was doing actually killed her. But now when you look at it, and when you look at the radiation dose that people receive in the industry, I had a guy that he retired from a plant that I worked at, that his one-time daily dose record was 2.5 rem of radiation in one shift. So that, those numbers don't mean a lot, but to give you a comparison, I did 20 years in the Navy and I received 0.247 rem over 20 years. So that's a, difference between, 90s and 2000s versus this guy was in the, commercial nuclear industry in the 70s and 80s. So, we're driving the radiation level down. Now, 2.5 rem is not actually that big of a risk, because you have to get to 50 before they'll start even monitoring you for radiation sickness. And radiation sickness doesn't really onset until 100. And to give you context on that, people go to the doctor, they get a CT scan. That's 1 rem of radiation from a CT scan. So, and then when you look at radiation treatments, they do a localized, and they're usually about 100 rem, to hit that tumor, to basically they're injecting radiation sickness onto the tumor. So, nuclear, we talk about how it goes from, power generation, but now we're into medical. That's all, we're still talking nuclear. And then, we always have to bring up the accidents. It's a big thing you have to talk about. And 3 Mile Island is the most famous U.S. accident. And the surrounding public around the site in Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, they received about 3.2 millirem. So that's one rem is 1,000 millirem. 3.2 millirem is equal to 1 dental x-ray. So you go to the dentist, right? They take the x-rays in your mouth. Each one of those is about 3 millirem. So the accident at 3 Mile Island, which completely destroyed the reactor from operating ever again, only provided an impact to the public that was equal to 1 dental x-ray.
But did everybody get free dental x-rays that year? That's the real question.
That I don't know.
So 1 dental x-ray is the average exposure for 3 Mile Island. You're talking about a CT. You received less radiation exposure in your 20 years in the Navy versus if you had gone for 1 CT scan.
Yeah, I would have had to have, at the rate I was getting radiation exposure, and assuming that was constant, because my actual rate, I joined in 98 and I retired in 2018. My rate of exposure actually decreased over that time. But if we assumed it was the same, it would take me 80 years of naval service in the naval nuclear industry to equal one CT scan. And that's just a baseline CT scan. When you do some of the more complex ones, they get into higher radiation levels.
Sure. So it sounds like and this actually leads into my next question really nicely, because I was about to ask, what, for the average person who's working at a nuclear power plant, what is their daily risk? What kind of radiation are they exposed to?
So it depends on the work they are. So, I've had days where I've had to do, we've had an issue that we need to do some troubleshooting in our areas that are literally locked, right? They're called locked high radiation areas. And there's areas that are called grave danger where you don't want to go in them because it's, this is dangerous work for the operators. And I've had a 1-day exposure where I received 39 millirem in one shift over the 12-hour period. But normally I don't get any. Normally the operators aren't getting a whole lot, maybe one, depending on what their job is. But normally, they're not getting, they're getting minimal exposure. But you have to, there are limits. There's federal limits on the amount of radiation exposure you can get each year and each quarter of the year. So like whenever you sign in to get your dosimetry to go do these jobs, it actually tells you how much radiation exposure you have available for that year. And it's I think right now they limit us to 1.7 rem, and so I think for last year I received 150 millirem. So I'm not even 10% of what the annual limit is. Now I explained the Navy how I did 20 years and received such low dose. Navy reactors are new compared to U.S. commercial reactors. U.S. commercial reactors are 1960s designs. So they're still under that old system. I talked about how, radiation, we've gotten better over the years, and they've done a lot of things to improve it. But, the Navy, their reactors are almost, the newest design reactor was literally is being built right now. I think they're getting ready to build it now, and it was designed 5 years ago. So brand new designs, completely new designs. So when you look at it, the radiation risk from the industry gets better over time. It's just with the commercial industry, you've got 50-year-old plants that are designed based on 50-year-old technologies, but they do things to improve it. One of the things that the nuclear industry does is they inject zinc into the coolant, and that actually causes the radioactive particles that would normally plate out onto the piping. Instead of plating out there, they remain in the water, and then it goes through the filters and are filtered out in the filters. So the overall radiation of the containment structures is going down over time.
Interesting. Now, with these older plants, is it possible, you had mentioned injecting zinc into the water, is it possible to do other retrofits? Like, could you take an existing plant under existing designs and say, if we have newer generation nuclear reactors, actually, turn them, use kind of the same guts, but just put new type of core into there?
So could you? Yes. And I will tell you that the Navy actually did the reverse of that, if you will. There was a submarine, there have been multiple submarines named Seawolf, but the first nuclear powered submarine actually had a liquid sodium reactor in it. So instead of using water for cooling, it used a sodium that was basically heated up to the point of melting. And after that first core was consumed, they actually replaced the reactor with a pressurized water reactor. So we can do it. Is it cost effective comes into the question.
Interesting. So I'm assuming if that comes into the question, that for some reactors the answer will be yes, and for some reactors the answer will be no. But what causes it to go either way?
Well, a lot of it is that chemistry is one. You talked about wishing you would go in chemistry. Chemistry is a big factor in nuclear, because you've got water in these reactors, and it's in contact with carbon steels for the most part, or just steel in general at high temperatures and high pressures. Well, that's a recipe for rapid corrosion. So you have to add things to maintain the pH right. You have to have the right, chemical compositions in there. You've got to remove impurities that are created. So it's a very complex chemistry process. And then when you want to switch that to, say, a pressurized water reactor to, say, a molten salt reactor, well, now you've got this large quantity of salt. And by the way, one of the most common salts used for a molten salt reactor is sodium chloride, which is, if you go into your cabinet and grab a little container of salt, that's sodium chloride. So you've seen what salt water does to out in the ocean. When it does to metal, it can it rusts things very quickly. And now you're going to put that into this carbon steel, so you might have to do some extra cladding and things like that to make it to manage that. So it just basically becomes a cost factor. And a lot of times it looks like the best way to do this would be just to build new. But one of the things that's interesting that you'll see that China's doing is that they're able to use a standardized nuclear reactor that is the same size as their coal boilers. And so their idea is that I know my steam, my turbine needs steam, and I just need to generate that steam. And if I can cut out my coal boiler and I can pop in a reactor, I have 90% of my infrastructure already there. So we could do something like that. Say I've got a turbine, a 1 gigawatt turbine, and it's connected to a reactor. Well, could I, say use a series of small or new reactors and connect it there? I know the steam system still works. How could I retrofit it? There's multiple ways to do that.
So it may be more cost effective in some cases to retrofit other types of power plants, like a coal power plant or anything that uses a turbine that spins, rather than to maybe retrofit an existing nuclear power plant. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that is. And then what's the other thing that's fascinating is that there are multiple ways of retrofitting. If you want to go from, say, the generation 2 design to a generation 4, that's extremely complex. But there's a company called Lightbridge, and they're designing new fuels. So the fuel assemblies, they're about 14 inches square, and they're like 12 feet long. And I can modify the fuel that goes into the reactor and how they're managed. And so Lightbridge is working on a new fuel that would make the reactors safer that exist in the U.S. and make them generate more power. And they would last longer. So it's like this weird, crazy thing. I had a conversation with Seth Gray, their CEO, about this. And they're talking that I could take a traditional nuclear reactor, I could put their new fuel design in there. The reactor would be uprated by 17%. And it would last longer. And the fuel can't melt like is in 3 Mile Island. And it won't generate the hydrogen like occurred in Fukushima that caused the issues there. So literally, it could solve multiple issues with just fuel technologies. And then I don't have to upgrade the reactor, from a generation 2 to a generation 4 with new coolants and new systems. I literally just take the old fuel out and put in this new upgraded fuel.
So then, what are the downsides? If this seems like a no-brainer, then
it is.
There's literally no downsides to just swapping out this new type of fuel?
We've done that, and we're doing that now. I mean, so the fuel that's in the reactors today is not the same type of fuel that was installed when they built them in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So right now there are 4 U.S. plants that have accident-tolerant test fuel assemblies operating in them. So they've got their normal, 100 to 300 fuel assemblies in there. And they've got a couple of them that are special test ones that they're going to pull out. They're going to get those fuel assemblies and then be shipped to a national laboratory to be analyzed. And then so that they can license this fuel for a full reactor. So now there's, and they're just accident tolerant. This isn't an upgraded fuel that's going to last longer and allow you to uprate your reactor. This fuel just will prevent a Fukushima 3 Mile Island event that's being tested now.
Okay, very fascinating. I want to jump to the issue of the water in a nuclear power plant for a second, because I've heard terms like heavy water, and we've talked about how we're basically generating steam to spin a turbine of some sort. So say we have a power plant, it requires a degree of water in it. Once that water's been used, what happens to that? Like, is it full of nuclear material? Do we have to decontaminate it? Like, what happens to it?
So every nuclear site has processing facilities, and they clean that water out. They pull out all the radioactive constituents, and then and they have to. There's release permits to release it. So that's it's no longer radioactive, or it's not radioactive to the point of an issue. Everything's radioactive, right? I'm drinking a cup of coffee. It's got water in it. That water contains hydrogen. Hydrogen comes in 7 forms, but 3 major forms we talk about: regular hydrogen, deuterium, which is the heavy water you talk about, and then tritium. Well, tritium is radioactive. Tritium is generated in nuclear power plants. It's also generated in the upper atmosphere. So, I always joke and say I'm going to consume some nuclear or some weapons-grade nuclear material right now. Because tritium is what was used to make the hydrogen bomb work, by the way.
Okay. Interesting.
And so there is a processing. So and you brought in a great conversation, because there's different. I showed you how complex the chart of nuclides are. Now, when you look at nuclear, there's different waste you have to manage. So there's actinic waste, which is just fuel. So that's uranium and plutonium, americium, and heavy elements that could be used into making, fuel. Very, very long life, right? We're talking, 24,000 year half-life for plutonium, billions of years for uranium, right? So, this is the stuff that everyone wants to manage. The thing is that it's very low radiation level. And the radiation they emit is an alpha particle. The dead layer of skin on your body will stop all alphas from damaging you. So you don't have to worry about it ever hurting you. If you ingest it, that's a problem. But so that's not an issue. And then you have fission products. Now, this is the stuff that's actually hard to manage from that standpoint, because that's when we talk about that atom strikes the neutron, produces those 2 fission products, those 2 little smaller elements. Well, they're really highly energetic, and they want to not have that energy because their nucleuses were basically just ripped apart and put together rapidly. So they've got a massive amount of energy in there, and they eject it in high energy gammas, right? And high energy gamma is, you go to the dentist and they give you that blanket thing to put on you for the X-ray, because it's made of lead. So these things are really powerful. They can penetrate a lot, and so you got to manage that. And then there's, like you mentioned, the water cleanup. Well, there's other things that, you've got, say little bits of metal that have to go, that are eroded off the piping that go through the reactor. A neutron hits that, it changes it into some radioactive material, and then we've got to manage that as well. So you've got these different varying things, and there's no one size fits all. So we've got different locations throughout the U.S. that could process, this type of material, other can process this type of material, and it even comes down to quantities. So I'm sure you've heard of Yucca Mountain, where they want to put all the spent fuel, the spent fuel in. Well, that's the spent fuel that they're concerned about primarily is the heavy actinides. And there's a facility in Carlsbad, New Mexico, called the WIP facility, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, that they're authorized to take plutonium waste. Plutonium is an actinide. But they can't take spent fuel, but they could take gloves that have plutonium all over it and store it in these barrels and put it in there. But you can't take a cask of this stuff. It's because of laws and regulations. And a lot of it's very arbitrary and almost very silly in the way that we manage it. Because I think they call it there's true transuranic waste and spent nuclear fuel, which are basically the same thing.
Sounds like something a committee would come up with.
It is.
I'm glad you brought up Yucca Mountain, because this is something I had heard about a long time ago, a number of years ago, and I recall hearing that it was going to open up sometime in the 2010s. I can't remember exactly when it was supposed to open. So is Yucca Mountain, the storage facility there, is that open yet, or is that still like a pipe dream? We're still waiting for that to come online.
On January 20th, 2009, the new administration that took office decided that they were going to shut down funding to continue with starting up the Yucca Mountain project. So basically on day one, when Barack Obama came into office, he shut down the Yucca Mountain project.
They shut it down. What? So actually, let's back up here, because some listeners might not know what was Yucca Mountain supposed to be used for? What was that site supposed to be used for?
So that site was supposed to be used by the commercial industry and the United States government to store all the nuclear waste. The waste is going to last for the 100,000 years is the arbitrary number that everyone talks about. They were going to ship it all into this deep repository in a mountain in Nevada, right? And it's rated for 10,000 years. So it's not like this is going to be a random thing. It's going to last longer than civilization is the way they rated it. So it's going to be basically stored with all these nuclear storage containers to put them in there. And it was just basically we're going to store it in there as a way of just holding this until we can either figure out a way to reprocess it in, say, a Generation 4 reactor, and we could definitely talk about that in the short term. But there's like a dozen states that you cannot build nuclear in until Yucca Mountain is open.
So it sounds like we have a slight catch-22. We can't build new nuclear reactors until Yucca Mountain opens. Is there funding available for it now, or is it still in a state of limbo?
So, unfortunately, when they shut it down, all the utilities rightfully sued the United States government because they were part of the funding source for it. And so there was the breach of contract. And now the United States government, because of that, not only did they have to pay the utilities back for all the money that they spent into it, but because Yucca Mountain isn't open, the United States government has to pay the utilities that store nuclear fuel on their sites, because of the Yucca Mountain was the storage facility for that. So there's actually some money in storing spent nuclear fuel. And this is a great segue to talk about a company called Holtec that is working on kind of an interim method. So they've developed a site and they're trying to get it approved in New Mexico that's near the Carlsbad site, actually, the WIPS facility, where they could do a temporary storage. So instead of being above or down below ground in a long-term repository, this would be an above ground facility similar to how we store the material now. So it's nothing different than what we're doing. But let's say that you've got the site out in Oregon called Trojan that all that's there is the switch yard where the electricity went into the grid and the spent nuclear pad. That's it. So everything else is completely gone. So if you could ship that out of there and put it to a site, and you could start consolidating this, then you kind of develop some leverage. But Holtec is looking at, seeing this as kind of a money-making method of the government is required to pay because they breached the contract with the nuclear industry.
It sounds like there's a little bit of perverse incentives going on. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, something that just crossed my mind is we're talking about storing all this nuclear waste, and it sounds like there is a segue to Gen 4 reactors, which we'll get to in a minute. However, something that crossed my mind, if we're storing all of this spent nuclear waste, is there a danger in just storing it? Like if we bump two objects together, like can they explode? Like what happens when we just store this material together?
So fortunately, the reactor physics of it there's not enough of the material close enough to cause a nuclear reaction. And there is still some that occurs, right? It's extremely low, but there's not enough to actually cause a sustained reaction. And as far as a safety goes, at my when I go out and I see this stuff all the time, and I joke I take selfies with it. You can walk up and hug these containers and not get any like minimal, if any, radiation. Because it's not like when it's being put in these spent fuel containers, it's actually had about a decade to cool off from the highest level of radiation in a spent fuel pit. But there's really it's interesting because it's not as big of a concern as people want to believe it is. They want to imagine it's a problem more than it is. The containers they're put in are literally designed to take a fully loaded jet airliner direct strike and not break them. They've actually tested them on rail cars before they put the fuel in them. When they were doing these, they actually put them on a train, bring it up to speed, and crash it into something, and the container survives. Right. So these aren't this isn't the cheap oil drum that everyone wants to imagine they are. These things can take a beating, and then they're sitting out in an open field. For the most part, or in a lot of cases now they're actually in a bunkered enclosure. But the older ones, literally, if you go to a nuclear site, you'll see what look like little pills in these neat rows. That's just the spent nuclear fuel.
Wow. Man, I'd love to get on the testing team for those nuclear containment vessels. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. And an interesting fact is that a lot of people talk about they imagine it's this mass quantity. If you took all of the spent nuclear fuel in the United States from 60 years of operations, it would fit on a football field 20 feet deep.
That's it?
That's it.
That sounds like nothing.
It by a landmass size, it is nothing.
We have landfills that take up more land area than that.
Yes.
That's stunning. I would have thought for some reason we'd have a lot more nuclear waste than that, but I guess not. That's incredible.
Well, it goes down to the energy density of it, right? There's the nuclear people are nerds, right? So we like to post up our little memes, and there's one where it's a graph, and it's a kind of a cartoonish graph, but it shows wind and solar at these really low amounts, and it's all on a sheet of paper, and it's got coal and natural gas and oil, and the little bars get bigger and bigger, and then it shows nuclear. And those old reel style paper, where it's all connected. Well,
yep.
The graph for nuclear for energy density is like 4 of those boxes of paper, stacked on it, and then the caption of it is logarithmic scale is for quitters.
That's awesome.
So, if you look at the energy density, right, and we were talking about that, if you look at a traditional reactor, if I mine uranium out of the ground and it filled this coffee mug right here, that would be enough to power you for your lifetime in a current reactor.
In a current reactor.
In a Generation 4 reactor, see if I could pull my pen apart here. This little cap right here, this is just a standard gel pen, right? That's enough to power your family for a century.
What? Hold on. We got to talk about Gen 4 here, because that sounds like a promise that just sounds too good to be true. That something that's about half the length of your typical gel pen would be enough to power my family for a century. How does that even work?
So So one of the things is that in a current reactor, they use uranium-235, and that's where this becomes the quantity. Is that uranium-235 only makes up 0.7% of the natural uranium, so less than 1%. So I have to mine this amount of uranium and process it to make enough to power you for your lifetime. In a generation 4 reactor, we use transmutation. I talked about that, the neutron hitting the uranium-238 atom and becoming uranium-239, which then becomes plutonium. Plutonium is just fuel in a different type of reactor. Typically, these generation 4 reactors, they're called fast reactors because they use a different type of neutron. It's a different energy state of neutron. But so in the current scenario, I'm only using 1% of this to actually power you, right? So, or less than 1%. So I'm using very little of the actual energy that's in this. It's still extremely dense compared to everything else, right? Imagine how much gasoline it would take to, power your lifetime. And, think about how big that tank would be, probably bigger than your house. But, this one coffee mug of uranium, using that uranium-235 will power you for your lifetime. But if I'm using a fast reactor, I'm using it all. So I'm turning it into plutonium. I'm using this to create fuel that can then use it all.
Interesting. So in these Gen 4 reactors, does that mean you're actually, say, instead of just using a little bit of that substance, you're now consuming the whole thing?
Yes, that's how it is. And the great thing about generation 4 reactors is that we talked about that spent nuclear fuel. I can actually take those fuel assemblies apart. I can do some level of reprocessing, and then I can put it into a reactor, and I can basically take my waste and turn it into energy and use the remaining about 94% of the actual fuel that's in those the spent fuel, because they enrich that uranium-235. But I can use the remaining energy in it to make power. And that's actually happening on planet Earth right now.
Really? Where?
In Russia. The Russians have a reactor called the BN-800. And the BN-800, her first fuel loadout was plutonium from the Russian nuclear weapons program. And then they just refueled at the beginning of the year. It only went online in 2016, so this is a new reactor. And after they did the initial fuel, the initial operations, they pulled out old fuel and they put in, quote, new fuel, and the new fuel was all spent nuclear fuel.
All spent nuclear fuel. So now they're using what would typically be just nuclear waste that we would have to store. They're repurposing it and putting it into this plant.
Yep. And there's plans to do that in the US as well. So there's a company called Oklo. They're a generation 4 company. They have a 1.5 megawatts. So this is, tiny. Large scale nuclear reactors about 1,000 megawatts. But their idea is they're very small. They fit, on a quarter acre lot. And they're going to use the leftover material from an early test reactor called EBR-2 as their initial fuel loadout.
Wow. So the Russians have got this online. There are some companies in the United States that are bringing online some Generation 4 reactors. But now you say 1.5 megawatt, like roughly how many homes would a reactor of that size be able to power?
1,000.
Around 1,000, so a good sized neighborhood then.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So they're, and having spoke with Carolyn Cochran, their COO, their idea behind it was, could I power a hospital, a university, a small town, say a skyscraper, so a very localized level of powering something, or a small town, 1,000 people, or a good size, sector of a community. I wouldn't even call it a neighborhood, because most neighborhoods are more than that, or smaller than that. So.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. Now, for a reactor that's about that size, what's the capital investment? What do these cost?
So I think when you're talking Generation 4 reactors, it comes out to being about they're about, was it 1.5 million for every megawatt, but it varies because you don't know different processes. But everything right now in the Generation 4 community is, they're all financial projections. So they're guesses, right? And I mean, having dealt with nuclear contracts at one of my jobs in the Navy, it's all a bunch of guesses. And until you've actually spent the hours, material, and budget, you don't know what the actual cost is. That's, it's hard to predict all that. And then the other problem we're going to come in with is that the people are going to say this is the initial projection and this is the first time build. I don't know if you've ever dealt with first time builds that are unique. They all go over budget and they all go over schedule. It's just the way it is until you get the infrastructure up. And the nuclear industry is, well aware of that. If you look at the Vogtle project, which are the only two Gen 3 reactors being built in the US, they're 50% over budget and they're 2 years behind schedule. But the U.S. and now we haven't built nuclear reactors in the U.S. commercial nuclear reactors in decades. So you have a loss of understanding of how that is. And if I go, into the Navy's built aircraft carriers essentially since the nuclear powered aircraft carriers continuously since the 1950s in the same shipyard. And that shipyard, literally, they finished building the USS George H.W. Bush and then started landing modules into the dry dock to build the Gerald R. Ford, which went about 40% over budget and was a year behind schedule. So even continually doing something to go from an old 1960s, 1970s aircraft carrier nuclear design to a 2000s, design, there was challenges associated with that. But the success story, if you look at the Ford class aircraft carrier, is the John F. Kennedy is going to come in, is looking like it's going to come in under budget. And it was looking like it was going to come in under schedule, but unfortunately there's delays that are being caused because of the COVID outbreak. They're not able to get through some of their testing that requires the crew. But so you're seeing that. And then they actually got to the point where the Navy signed a contract with the shipbuilder for the next two aircraft carriers, and their total cost for the two follow-on aircraft carriers is less than the Gerald R. Ford. So you're getting two carriers for less than the price of one.
Wow, that's incredible. Now on the aircraft carrier, like what size? And if you're not allowed to say, that's totally fine. But like, how much power would you require, and how large are the reactors that are put on these ships?
So the actual numbers are classified, so I can't give you specific details. But I would tell you that a large scale commercial reactor is about 2.5 aircraft carriers and about 25 submarines of power.
Okay.
So.
All right, so that's that gives you a good proxy. That's really fascinating. So with these Gen 4 reactors, we're talking about we're able to generate a good amount of power, use up all these spent fuel rods, but we're still dealing with the problem that we can't quite cost it out. Is the cost really the only barrier to getting more of these deployed? Because this seems like, once again, it seems like if we got the cost under control, then in terms of a solution to us using coal and other fossil fuels, it seems like a no-brainer.
Well, there's also regulations that are in the way or that don't exist that preclude some of these Generation 4 reactors. So in the U.S., there's something called the ASME codes. Don't quiz me on what ASME stands for, but it's basically inspection of boilers. Is where it started out with, right? So boilers in the 1800s were exploding and destroying blocks back in the 1800s, and so they developed these federal codes to make sure that they're called pressure vessels are being built to a certain quality. So right now in the United States, we only have ASME codes as far as the nuclear industry that exist for light water reactors, which encompasses all the commercial reactors in the US and liquid metal reactors. So if you want to build a Generation 4 reactor in the United States, your options are light water, which means you're really not a Generation 4 reactor, or you're liquid metal. Well, and a lot of your audience are going to say, well, what about molten salt reactors? We've mentioned those before. There's no pathway right now in the United States to license a molten salt reactor because we don't have the regulatory infrastructure in place to conduct the inspections on them. That's just one minor aspect. And then there's also, things of under the Carter administration, there were changes to the Fed regulations that basically said you can't use fast reactors as for a commercial power source.
Why not?
So here's where the nuclear community is extremely small. We talked about the USS Seawolf, where they converted it from a molten sodium reactor, which was a fast reactor, to a pressurized water reactor. Well, there was a young naval officer that went through the Naval Nuclear Power Program that was going to be the engineer on there. Unfortunately, his parents got ill, and he went back to Georgia to his peanut farm, and then went on to become governor of Georgia, and then became the president of the United States that removed that code because he was greatly influenced by a guy named Hyman G. Rickover, who's the father of the nuclear navy, whom basically wanted the light water reactor design because he understood it better. And I don't know the whole details of it, but it's really fascinating how Jimmy Carter is this weird, interesting event in the nuclear industry that shut down what, if we would have had, that was the 1970s, if we would have had those 40 years of experience in working with these reactors, they would be, much safer. We would have understood them. And, there are concerns with these liquid metal reactors. And we've had meltdowns in the past. The first couple of meltdowns in the United States of test reactors were liquid metal reactors, but they were Chernobyl level events where the reactors were overpowered. And Chernobyl, because it was water, it caused a steam explosion. These things, they literally pulled the melted fuel out and put new fuel in and restarted.
So these newer designs of reactors, like because Chernobyl was a horrifying incident. There's no two ways about it. But like with these new reactors, it sounds like even if there's some sort of incident, you can still recover and still use the reactor in the future.
So that's based on the 1950s design. So we're not even talking, 80s. We're talking, the 1950s designed reactors where they were destroying them routinely. I say routinely because it's more provocative, but we were doing this frequently. And then we figured out, and you have to understand is in those days, we literally were using manual cranks to operate the control rods that control the reaction, right? Whereas now that's done with switches, and there's electronic circuitry to prevent that, or to automatically shut the system down if you have an overpower situation. So, like when you look at it from the standpoint of the 1950s, and then you get into the 60s and 70s, we developed these automatic protective features, and then now when you're looking at the new designs, they have passive safety features that don't even require electronics. Basically, and I had a discussion with a guy that's working on some stuff for a company called Lead Cold out in, I think, Belgium, where their reactor, when it heats up, it has a piston that the gas in it heats up and expands, which then drives a control rod to shut the reaction down. So that if you get your reactor too hot, it just automatically shuts itself down. No electronics, it's pure mechanical.
That's a creative solution. And so we've got more of these it sounds like we've got more of these safety measures. The newer generation we get, the more safety measures we get, but we're in this weird state where we're stuck using the old reactor technologies because to build newer ones, the regulations just don't exist. Is that a fair assessment?
So there are the regulations that don't exist, and then there's the regulations that preclude it. And then on top of it, when you look at it, we've never had a commercial reactor that was anything other than a light water reactor, whether it's boiling water or pressurized water reactor in the United States. So the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission is going to license these, doesn't know how to license anything other than these light water reactors. So, that's like the third aspect of this that is a major hurdle to get through, is how do you get them licensed? And going back to Oklo, they actually took a radically different process. So instead of taking these large scale reactors and miniaturizing them, which is what most of the Gen 4 companies are doing, Oklo said NASA has been sending remotely operated nuclear reactors into space since the 1960s. And they said, why don't I upscale them? So you have regulatory framework that exists for that. And I'm not sure if it falls under the NRC. And when you get into the government side of things, I don't have a whole lot of information. I could talk the Navy side, I could talk the commercial side, but when you get into the Department of Energy side of things, it gets very, they've all sorts of crazy different things that they're able to do that the Navy, which has their own regulatory framework, and the NRC, which does the commercial industry, has a different set of regulatory framework. But so Oklo has said, I'm going to do this completely different method. And so theirs is literally an upscaled space reactor.
An upscaled space reactor. That's that's clever. I like it.
Yeah,
now,
it's genius. And the great thing about it is that if you're looking at a large scale commercial reactor, you have operators that have to take actions within seconds sometimes, right? To ensure the reactor is being maintained safely. So if you have a space probe that's, say out beyond Neptune, you don't have seconds, right? Because it takes hours for, anything to get sent out there. So the space reactors are literally designed to operate without humans.
Right. Yeah, it has to operate autonomously for decades.
Yeah.
Decades even. So, the more that I hear about these Gen 4 nuclear technologies, the more that I just keep thinking to myself, this seems like a perfect solution to a lot of problems that we're facing. If only we had the right regulations, if only we had the right licensing procedures in place. Now, what if we've been talking about large scale nuclear power plants. If I think back to a lot of the video games I played in the past, one of the common themes that keeps coming up is this idea that our entire world at a micro level, even in our homes, will have these little miniature nuclear reactors. And, we'll even have, like, if I pick up my cell phone, this thing will have a little nuclear battery in it or something like that. If you go down to a smaller scale, do you still run into these same regulatory issues? Like, would it ever be commercially practical to make these, small nuclear generators even?
There's the Office of Nuclear Energy. And if you haven't looked at their stuff, they have an amazing discussion, because they talk about NASA, and they talk about a lot of the advances in the laboratories, because they're in charge of a lot of that stuff. These NASA reactors are about the size of a mini fridge, and they'll power about 4 homes. So, yeah. So a mini fridge that can power 4 homes, right? For a decade.
What?
Yeah. So could you miniaturize it? Yes. And in fact, if you go back to the 1950s, Ford actually had a nuclear powered car design. They never built it, but there was a nuclear powered car design that would run on a reactor. Imagine if you bought your car and, you got to change the oil every 3,000, the oil and grease every 3,000 miles, but the car is going to run for its entire life on the reactor that's in it, right? So you don't have to get fuel. Or there was the nuclear power train in the 1950s, or even it was never operated to fly on its reactors, but the United States Air Force in the 1960s, they built, and this was the first molten salt reactor, they built the molten, the nuclear aircraft, where they literally built jet engines that were nuclear powered. They proved that they could make it work. The plane flew once under traditional power to make sure it could fly with the weight, but they never actually operated the reactors to make it work. But they basically used a proof of concept that I could make a jet that could fly using a nuclear reactor.
And now if it could have flown using a nuclear reactor, would that have produced any emissions?
No.
No emissions.
No emissions.
Same with the car, same with the train.
Yeah.
So
no emissions.
So you're talking about something that has zero emissions. The only real issue we have to deal with is the spent nuclear material, which, if we're talking about lasting a decade or more, is a fairly trivial problem to figure out in the long run.
Well, and we were talking about that. Our current design, right? We use this amount of fuel, and we're still left with basically this amount of waste, right? We just assume it's all waste, even though we still have 99% of this is still available fuel.
The coffee cup size.
Yeah. This will power you for your lifetime. When you're getting into generation, but this is going to last for, the uranium, it's going to last for the rest of the planet's lifetime. It was there when we started, and it's going to remain here for, unless we consume it in a reactor. The fission products are left over, the 1% of this that we converted into energy, that we created those fission products. Those fission products, 1% of those fission products will last 300 years.
Whoa.
So when I'm using my Generation 4 reactor, the waste stream that comes out of that will only last 300 years. But again, going back to my little gel pen here, right? Half of that, the second I shut the reactor offline, isn't radioactive.
Wow. And if we're talking about 300 years in terms of radioactive decay, and in terms of decay, is like nothing compared to, some of the if we look at the half-life of some other nuclear materials, you're talking like tens of thousands of years or something like that, if I'm correct?
Yeah.
Wow. So it's now, what are if you're building, say, a small, mini fridge size reactor, for instance, like what's the cost of that right now, and what could we get the cost to?
If we went to that, and we could, and you got to think it'd be even like a full scale production model, right? Because if I could power 4 homes for a decade, well, I could probably power my home for my lifetime, right? And if you started mass producing these things, I would imagine that it would probably be the number one cost of your home, and it'd probably about the cost of the home when you put it in there. But imagine you never have an electricity payment ever again. You could run all your electronics as much as you want. Your kids leave the lights on, you're like, oh, okay.
So even if it does, let's spitball this and say, like, even if it does cost, in the worst case scenario, you have a home that's $300,000, your reactor costs another $300,000 on top of that. Even in that worst case, we're still talking about potentially a system that has way fewer externalities. Like, because I'm putting on my economist hat and going, coal, wind power to a certain degree, anything certainly that relies on fossil fuels is going to have a lot of externalities. We have to deal with, the emission of CO2. We have to deal with, actually getting the coal out of the ground, transporting all those materials. Like there's a lot that goes into that, along with, when we actually, burn the material through combustion. That's released. CO2 is certainly not the only product. We see that with diesel powered cars. That seems like the no brainer, except that releases the NOx, which is acid rain material, right? So suddenly,
Yeah.
even if we have these expensive reactors, relatively speaking, we still reduce all those weird externalities. And you're absolutely right. We get rid of the need for an electricity bill, and potentially, because where I'm based out of in southwestern Ontario here in Canada, our house and our water, it's heated with natural gas, which, maybe I believe that's a byproduct that's a product of fossil fuels. But if we could switch to electric fired furnace and electric fired water heater that's powered by a small nuclear reactor, I mean, suddenly it's, we're dealing with something that has basically zero emissions, aren't we?
Yes. Well, I mean, if you even look at, just from the construction process of a nuclear power plant, we'll go back to the large scale nuclear power plant. There is 6 times as much concrete in an equivalent solar farm than there is in a commercial nuclear reactor. 6 times the concrete in the solar farm.
In the solar farm.
Yeah. So because of how large you have to make your solar farm. So there's a solar farm out in Australia. It's rated at 2 gigawatts, and it requires 13,000 acres of land to function. All right. Diablo Canyon in California is on 13 acres and is 2 gigawatts of power.
Okay, I'm just dumbfounded. Repeat those numbers one more time for me so we can do an apples to apples comparison.
Oh, it's going to get even better because when I start talking about capacity factors. All right. So Diablo Canyon is a nuclear power plant out in California. It's 2 gigawatt output capacity. That same equivalent output on a solar farm in Australia is on 13,000 acres, 1,000 times the land area that a nuclear power plant needs.
1,000 times the land mass. Now, the argument that you could make for the solar, though, and this is where my mind goes, is you're going, okay, well, we don't have to deal with any of the spent nuclear waste or any of the issues surrounding nuclear power, but does that? I mean, what's the life cycle of a solar panel?
Typically 10 to 20 years.
That's it?
Yes.
So 10 to 20 years, that sucker's spent, and we have to replace it.
Yes.
Whereas with the nuclear, what's the average life cycle of a nuclear plant? Like, how long can they remain in service before we have to take it offline? Average.
Well, so I'm going to have to answer 2 separate questions. So there's the life of the plant, all the infrastructure on it, the reactor vessel, the turbine, and all that stuff, which will replace parts throughout it. And right now, the U.S. has licensed 4 units to last for 80 years with all that, the concrete, the base infrastructure. The reactor cores themselves, going back to the fuel that's, power your life with that, the fuel in those lasts for 4.5 years, but you refuel it in 1/3 cycles. So every 18 months, you have to shut a reactor down to refuel it. But that's, changing the gas. It's like, every 18 months, you got to go to the tank, to the gas pump to fill your car up, as opposed to your car can last for 80 years. Now, we talked about the company Lightbridge with their new fuel designs. We could potentially see commercial nuclear reactors that were built in the 1960s staying online past 2060.
So we're talking about getting them past the 100-year mark.
Yes.
Well, you're dropping so many knowledge bombs on me today that I'm dumbfounded that we haven't. It seems like a no. Well, I guess that's why the government hasn't gone for it. They're no-brainers.
So if you use now, when you go into capacity factors, right? So capacity factor meaning if you operated at, if you assume that you operated at peak power, 100% power for the entire year, that's 100% capacity factor, right? So you've got Diablo Canyon operating at 2 gigawatts for all 365 days. It would be, that's 2 times 365 would do 730 gigawatt hours for the year, right?
Yeah.
So the capacity factor for nuclear is 93.5%, meaning that if you took it's going to operate at, literally we operate at 100% power or they're offline for refueling. So you're going to get 93.5 times the 730 gigawatts of power in a year, right? That's
right. But at the same time, okay, so this is where I get a little bit confused, and maybe you can answer this for me, you probably can, you're a genius. We've got that operating capacity, but the power demand is not constant. So what happens? How do we bridge that gap? Do we just have like gigantic batteries that we store extra power in? Like what happens to when there's not as much demand on the grid?
So you can ramp your units. That's very difficult on these old nuclear reactors. They don't ramp easily, but you can do it. The other thing is that these new generation reactors are actually designed to be ramped. And, you can do that. It can be inherently done, using the Navy as an example. You're on a warship. Warships are not designed to go one speed like a commercial vessel is. So you constantly have to go from slow to fast and fast to slow. Having been the officer of the deck on an aircraft carrier during flight operations, and we had an aircraft that had an issue and there was no wind and it needed higher winds, otherwise it was going to crash in the ocean. We went from a relatively low speed to a fast speed. So that was a matter of minutes to go from low power to high power as opposed to hours for a commercial reactor. But so we can do that. It's not as difficult as people want to make it sound. So you can ramp them. One of the things that people don't talk about, we go back to that capacity factor, is with wind and solar, they actually don't operate in cycle with the peak demand period. So they're actually coming offline when the peak power demand is going up.
Oh, interesting. So they're almost moving in complete opposite. They're moving in complete opposite directions of when the power is needed.
Yes, and that's actually one of the biggest concerns about it is that you have to keep your fossil backups online to deal with that demand whenever your solar is automatically ramping itself, and wind, which by the way, that ramp down of wind and solar occurs around the time that the sun sets, and that's when wind actually drops off too.
Right.
It's typically after the sun.
So then where are we at now? Where are we at today with these Gen 4 nuclear reactors and potentially getting a whole new generation of nuclear reactors online as a way, as a clean, green way to power our lives? Our thirst for power is not going to be satiated with, we're not going to be able to reduce the amount of power we need. It's only growing. Where are we at today?
So if I can speak mainly to the U.S., but I will speak to some other nations as well. As far as Generation 4, the Russians and Chinese, the Russians have an operating Generation 4 reactor in the BN 800. They are building a molten lead reactor that's a test reactor. It's about 300 megawatts. The Chinese have about a half dozen Generation 4 reactors under construction and at different stages of those construction. And there are probably 24 Generation 4 companies between Canada and the United States that are working on licensing processes. So in Canada, you've got, I think there's a competition for Canadian nuclear laboratories for 3 designs to be built. So the Canadian Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I believe, has preliminary issued licenses to begin construction in the next 3 to 5 years for 3 different types of Generation 4 reactors in Canada. The United States has an advanced Generation 3 reactor designed by NuScale that is licensed and is going to commence construction in 2021, I believe, so next year in Idaho. They're a 60 megawatt unit. They're going to build a 12 unit facility. So that's what, 70 times 6. It's like 600 or 720 megawatts or something like that. So 60 times 12 is 720 megawatts. So that's a more advanced generation. It's going to use a different fuel loading than we currently use. It is a light water reactor, but instead of needing to be refueled every 4.5 years, it's every 12 years. So basically, you bring a unit down every year to refuel because you've got a dozen of them. And then you've got Oklo, which they are seeking. They have submitted their license in the United States. They're hoping to break ground in 2022, and because their reactor is so small, they should have it hopefully completing testing in 2024. So, but that's really where we're at. No one else has submitted a license in the United States for a Gen 4 reactor. The United States does have a couple. There's a company called GE Hitachi that has a 300 megawatt boiling water reactor. It's an advanced Generation 3 reactor that has been submitted for licensing. But I see those as successes, specifically with the NuScale and the GE Hitachi, because the United States, you have to develop momentum. It's true of everywhere, but these 2 reactors are called SMR, small modular reactors, and they're the gap that gets us from the old style of nuclear and then scaling it down to where we can start thinking about nuclear differently. And once you know how it goes, once you get the ball rolling, it's a lot easier to keep it moving. So
then what can just average citizens like me I'm not a nuclear expert in any way, what can we do to help get that ball rolling?
A lot of it is the conversation. So just talking about it. I post an article on LinkedIn every single day. I post multiple things on Twitter, and I just got an Instagram account, which makes me feel oddly old because I've kind of relegated that to my kids. But seeking out movers and shakers in the industry and realize that it is a big, complex thing, and we're not all necessarily pushing down the same path. Because there's different groups that are saying, that are, using the save the existing plants. And I don't necessarily, promote that. But, there's enough of an organization where you may not like my style. That's fine. It doesn't hurt my feelings. But you may prefer Generation Atomic style and Eric Myers and the way that he's promoting nuclear. But the more people that are talking about it, the more it develops into the national conversation or the international conversation. And there are people that talk about nuclear that aren't necessarily in nuclear that promote it. And those people, they talk with experts like myself or Mike Schellenberger and mention it. And you've interviewed one of those particular people, and that's Scott Adams, who's a huge proponent of nuclear. And, bringing up their discussions, Scott retweets me normally about once every few days or so. With the coronavirus, he's tapered off. I've backed off a little bit because it's not the big thing. But I will say this, the nuclear industry has actually been a leader in how to get the nation or the world restarted in this coronavirus. So we have to refuel these plants or they can't operate. Right now, Canadian reactors are different. They can refuel online, so you have a little more flexibility up in our friends to the Great White North. But in the United States, we have to shut our units down. And to do these refuelings, it's not, you can't just use the current people. You have to bring in a bunch of people in to do these, these refuelings. So how do you manage that in an outbreak? So they're doing things like, establishing social distancing parameters, putting up plexiglass in key work locations. You've got the main control room where people are being required to wear masks and gloves when they're operating the equipment. You have to wash your hands before you go in there. They're checking temperatures before you go in. If you even, they're even now just doing 100% testing, right? Show up to work, we're testing you for coronavirus, whether you have symptoms or not, because they're able to do this because, electricity is so important that they want to make sure that our grid is, secure and safe, because without electricity, hospitals have to go into emergency power sources, which means that you're not actually treating people. You're just hopefully keeping ventilators online for a few hours waiting for the power to come back.
Right. Wow. So I was just about to ask, could this, if we're talking about these new reactors and existing reactors too, it seems like an economic stimulus method too.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there's huge potential for this. I did the math one time, and going back to that whole contrast between wind and solar, the renewables, if you will, and nuclear. So California has spent $100 billion on renewable energy sources. Between biomass, solar, and wind, it accounts for 25% of California's electricity. If I took that same $100 billion and I had built AP1000 reactors, so this is a reactor that's currently under construction in the US, there's 4 built out in China, and I built those in California, I could have replaced every single method of power generation they have existing, to include Diablo Canyon, which is still online, all their hydro, all their natural gas, all their oil, and it'd be 100% nuclear.
For the same money.
For the same money.
That sounds like a deal to me.
Yeah.
So it really sounds like for the average citizen, the best thing that we can do is really keep the conversation going, and just, with our politicians, really just bring up these, because the facts and figures speak for themselves with contrast and compare. And really just point them towards experts like you. Is that the best thing that we can do?
That is the best thing that we can do right now. And just engaging in the politicians, because they listen. They really do. There's a representative out of Tennessee that he shot a tweet at President Trump saying, "We need fast reactors now." And I looked and I noticed that he's following me. And I go, so I love your tweet. And he goes, "Yeah, I got that from you." So the politicians are actually listening to the public, and they are, they actually, do want to find out, what the public thinks and how to make this work. And the more people that are vocal on social media about it, the more they're going to, push, for these advanced technologies. Right.
Well, it makes perfect sense to me. The only thing, and I never thought I would correct a nuclear physicist, but the only thing I got to correct you on is I actually interviewed Joshua Lysick, and Scott Adams retweeted our retweet. I have not yet interviewed Adams himself, but you never know.
Oh, okay.
That's okay, though. So if people want to find out more about Gen 4 reactors, if they want to find out more about you, where should they go on the internet?
You can go to my website. It's gen4nuclear.com. That's GEN. The Roman numeral 4 is an IV, nuclear.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Sub Schneider. That's sub as in submarine, because I served on a few submarines. And then my last name, Schneider, SCHNEIDER. And I also like to push at Gov Nuclear, GOV Nuclear, because they have some amazing stuff they're putting out talking about nuclear energy. They do have a great PR campaign, and they've been doing amazing work. So
excellent. I feel so much better educated about nuclear power now. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I truly appreciate it. This has been an absolute blast, and I hope for the listeners it helps take some of maybe the fear out of nuclear power, because it feels like something we have to be careful about, but as long as we're careful, it's a very safe, very clean way to generate power.
And I agree with that. And if you notice, one thing that I don't do is I don't shy away from the accidents. So I bring them up because they are a part of our past, right? Our past failures is what has changed the industry into its current success.
That's, I think, a beautiful way to end off the show. Mark Schneider, thank you so much for coming on Let's Solve the Universe. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And we'll talk to you next time, dear listener, on Let's Solve the Universe. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Go wash your hands. Love you all.